Hello, welcome to Tea Time in Olympia. My name is Amy Layton. On today's show, I'm going to be discussing gender identity with Dr. Ellen Hardin, as well as talking with a well-known local activist, Luke Miller, who will be sharing his truth as part of our My Truth series. But first, I would like to take a moment to tell you a little bit about the show. The ultimate goal of Tea Time in Olympia is to bring a better understanding of the topics and issues that surround the trans and gender nonconforming community. We here at Tea Time have heard time and time again from people who would like to understand more about trans issues but are afraid to ask. Through this show, we hope to bring them some answers to their questions through open and honest conversations. We also wish to serve as a resource for the trans community by sharing personal stories, highlighting community groups and events and organizations. Let's jump right into today's show by going to Luke Miller to help us out with some terminology commonly used when discussing gender issues.
Hi, welcome to Tea Time Olympia. I'm Luke, and today I'm going to acquaint you with some of the words that you may hear us use on the show, and some of the terminology that you may encounter when you're out in the world interacting with transgender and gender nonconforming people. I'm going to start with assigned sex or assigned gender at birth. In our culture, we typically assign a sex to a newborn infant on the basis of the appearance of its external genitalia. When a baby is born, the doctor looks between its legs, and if he sees a penis, he says it's a boy, and if he doesn't see a penis, he says it's a girl. On the basis of that determination, a social role is assigned to that child, and they are educated and socialized in accordance with that role. Gender roles are set by society, and they differ from culture to culture and throughout time. The culture we currently live in holds that women or people assigned female should embody a certain kind of characteristic, and people assigned male should embody a different characteristic. This system is maintained by a rigid set of social institutions such as marriage, religion, education. Gender identity refers to a person's deeply held conviction about whether they are a man, a woman, or some other gender. This deeply held conviction or sense of self may or may not correspond to the role or the sex that that person was assigned at birth. If a person identifies in a way that is consistent with their assignment at birth, they're usually referred to as cisgender, which is a Latin-derived term meaning to stay in one place or to not to move. So a cisgender person is a person who does not feel the need to change their outward appearance to conform to their inner sense of self. If a person's deeply held gender identity does not conform to the sex they were assigned at birth, they're usually referred to as transgender, another Latin-derived term which means to move from one place to another. So a person who wishes to transition from the role they were assigned from birth to some other gender role to be more in alignment with their deeply held sense of self is referred to as a transgender person. A gender nonconforming person is anyone whose gender expression or identity differs in some way from the expectations of the role they were assigned at birth. A person who is gender questioning is someone who has not yet decided or come to a decision about their deeply held inner sense of gender identity. Gender expression or presentation refers to a person's outward way of showing what their gender identity is. This can include things like dress, hairstyles, mannerisms, patterns of speech, and other social modes of expression that are typically assigned a gender value according to the gender norms of our culture. A transsexual person is typically defined as someone who feels that their physical embodiment with regard to sex is out of alignment with their deeply held sense of gender identity and will be strongly motivated during their lifetime to change their outward reality to be more consistent with their inner sense of gender identity. Whether or not they ever actually achieve that transition, they are still regarded as a transsexual. The transition can involve many different things. It can involve physical changes using medical tools such as hormone replacement therapy and surgery. It can involve changing one's outward appearance through dress, hairstyles, cosmetics, hair removal, and it can involve legal changes such as altering gender markers on one's legal documents and changing one's legal name. Non-binary identified people are people whose gender identity falls outside the strict binary system of male equals man equals masculine or female equals woman equals feminine. There are many specific identities within the non-binary category, including, but not limited to, genderqueer, gender fluid, agender, gender bent, and others. A cross-dresser is a person who prefers to, on occasion, for various reasons, dress in a manner that is consistent with a gender different from the one that they were assigned at birth. There are many different reasons why a person might choose to cross-dress. They include factors of inner identity, and they also may include what we call drag queens or drag kings or drag performers who cross-dress for purposes of performance and artistic reasons. A two-spirit person. Two-spirit is a label specific to Native American culture that denotes a person who is in some way sex or gender nonconforming, as that is determined by their specific culture. Quite often, a two-spirit role, depending on the specific nation involved, may carry a specific role within society, usually a spiritual role or some other kind of special social role assigned to people who identify as two-spirit. Transphobia, or as some prefer, trans-antagonism, is the state of fearing and hating people who are gender nonconforming or transgender. Usually this has to do with political reasons, sometimes religious reasons, but it has to do with the prejudice that trans people encounter in a binary gendered society. And that's all we've got for right now, and we will revisit the question of terminology as more terms come up, and we'll say more about some of these terms in future shows as they come up and as we use them. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome my guest, Dr. Ellen Hardin. She is joining me today to discuss gender identity and social issues. So let's get right to it, and thank you for joining us, Dr. Hardin.
You're welcome.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your medical background?
I've known that I wanted to be a physician from the time I was about 14 years old. I entered the University of Missouri at Kansas City in an accelerated medical program directly out of high school. Did my training in internal medicine at the University of Missouri at Kansas City as well. Then I practiced in Oklahoma for about 20 years, and at that time I discovered that I couldn't continue to live with the amount of gender confusion that I was having in my life, and I transitioned from male to female in 2001 and 2002. I then came to work for Group Health in Tacoma, Washington, and I've been there since. I established their gender medicine program.
Oh.
And I see a number of gender identity patients currently. I've seen about 200 different patients since I started seeing gender patients at Group Health.
If there are any other healthcare professionals that happen to be watching the show today, what are a few important things that they should know when it comes to treating transgender patients?
Well, I think the first thing that they need to realize is that transgender patients want to be treated like anybody else. We want to be treated as people. We want to be treated with respect. If they're going to try to deal with gender issues, then they need to have experience and training before they launch into treating patients. I currently use the World Professional Association of Transgender Health, or the WPATH guidelines, to guide my care, and that's a good starting point.
What is the WPATH?
WPATH is an international organization that was initially known as the Harry Benjamin Society, and it was established to provide uniformity in care for transgender people. It has so-called standards of care which guide our care and make sure that we're rendering good care to anyone that we see.
Next, I'd like to speak to you a little bit about gender identity. Could you please tell us what gender identity and gender expression are?
Let's start with some definitions. Sex is what we think of as biology, or what genitalia you have. That's what you're born with. Gender identity is the feeling that you have within yourself about who you are. And usually sex matches gender, and that's called cisgender. If someone is born one sex but really identifies with another sex, that's considered transgender.
Is gender identity a choice?
No, I think the overwhelming medical evidence now is that gender identity is not a choice. This is how you're born. There was a study in Nature in 1995 that looked at the bed nucleus of the of the stria terminalis in the brain, and it was found that in this area there are definite anatomic differences between males and females, between homosexual males, and between transgendered male to female individuals. This was an autopsy study done after death. None of these patients had received hormones, so those weren't factors. This appears to be innate anatomic differences in people.
Could you tell us what the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation are?
Well, gender identity is how you identify. Who do I think I am? Am I male or am I female? Or am I somewhere in between? Sexual orientation is who you're attracted to. So, that's, are you attracted to males or females? And gender identity has nothing really to do with sexual orientation.
Could you tell us what causes a person to have a particular gender identity?
I don't know that we really know why a particular person develops a particular sexual identity. In the study I mentioned in Nature, there was some evidence that during development in the womb, there are pulses of hormones that normally establish anatomic differentiation toward male or toward female. And there's some thought that it's in this period that something is different. There are normally 2 peaks of hormone development in the womb, and there's some thought that the second peak is not what it's supposed to be, and that causes the brain not to be masculinized or feminized, as the case may be.
Could you tell us how common transgender people are?
Well, at this time I started my transition in the early 2000s, the conventional wisdom that was that about 1 in 30,000 males was transgender. Now we know that that's an incredibly low estimate. Current estimates are that somewhere in between 1 and 3%, between 1/10 and 1/3 of 1% of all patients are transgender.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So that says somewhere in between 2 and 5 and 1,000.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty common number.
Yeah, it didn't make sense when we were talking about 1 in 30,000, because at the time, as of 2005, there were about 70,000 post-operative transsexuals in the United States. And that would certainly be way beyond 1 in 30,000.
That's a very valid reasoning there. Let's see, you've gone over a little bit about transgenderism in Nature. Could you tell us a few more examples of transgenderism in Nature?
Well, sexual orientation and being transgender don't exist just in humans. There are many animal examples of this. Homosexuality has been documented in over 1,500 different species of animals now, and transgendered individuals within herds and so forth have been demonstrated in about 500 species now.
Oh, wow.
Sheep have been more studied than any other animal group, and we know that about 9% of sheep are exclusively homosexual. And there certainly are transgender individuals in herds of sheep. Most common are male sheep that integrate into the herd in a female role.
Interesting. I had heard that there were, growing up, I never realized or even heard that there were examples of transgenderism in nature or even homosexuality in nature, because at the time that wasn't what was taught in schools.
Yeah, well, the religious right would like you to think that it's exclusively a human issue and that it's exclusively a choice, but it's not.
Clearly, and science has clearly backed that up.
Absolutely.
That it's biological and not a choice.
Absolutely.
Let's move on to the next subject, and that would be social issues. What are some of the social issues facing transgender people?
Well, I think a large number of the social issues facing transgender people are a result of the discrimination that is so prevalent in our society. We do know that in children who are well supported, they don't have the issues of depression and anxiety that that transgender people who transition later in life have. We know that in general, transgender people suffer hugely from depression. 41% of transgender people have attempted suicide at some time in their life, and suicidal ideation is almost universal within our community. There was a study, the report of the National Transgender Discrimination Study was released 4 or 5 years ago. This was a study of about 6,500 people in the United States and the United States territories, Puerto Rico, Guam, Virgin Islands, and so forth. And it was a survey designed to find out what kind of challenges transgender people face. It found that the risk of being homeless if you're transgender is more than twice. Your risk of abusing substances is 2 or 3 times that of the general population.
Oh, wow.
Your risk of working in underground industries, meaning prostitution or drug dealing, is 2 to 3 times that of the general population. You're more than 3 times as likely to have an income under $10,000 a year, to struggle with poverty. We know that you are more likely to be stopped by police and have an unfavorable opinion of police. At least a fifth of patients, or a fifth of transgender people, have reported being actively discriminated against by police. More than half would hesitate to contact a police officer for help in a situation. Housing is difficult. Jobs are an issue. It's very difficult to get and maintain employment, especially if your identity or if your identifying documents don't match your presentation.
You've gone a little bit into discrimination. What kinds of discrimination do trans people face? Like what's the most common form of discrimination that trans people face?
I think it's difficult to say exactly what form is more common. Discrimination against trans people, unfortunately, is pervasive. Housing, accommodation in public spaces, education, employment, substance abuse, dealing with the medical community, dealing with the law enforcement community, dealing with prison populations, and if someone happens to be arrested. You know, discrimination is pervasive in all of those situations.
Have you yourself faced any of these kinds of discrimination?
I've been very fortunate. I have had very little discrimination. You know, when I transitioned, being a physician, I had no idea if I would be able to continue to work in medicine, but that did not turn out to be a problem. On the other hand, I've had 5 trans foster children, and all of them faced huge amounts of discrimination at the hands of law enforcement. In the little town where I lived, one of my children was being harassed by their natural father. They had transcripts of text messages that he was sending them and so forth. They called the police, and they were subsequently charged with making a false statement to police, even though they had physical evidence documenting what they were alleging.
Wow. Wow, that shocks me still to this day. I mean, I understand it. I've seen that kind of stuff before, but that really shocks me that they had all this evidence and the police charged them with making a false report.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much for being on the show today, and I'd like to have you back in the future to continue talking more on these issues.
I'd be happy to come back.
Today we have a good friend here in the studio with us who will be sharing a little bit about his truth. And let's start off with the basics. So, could you tell us your name?
My name is Lucas Scott Miller.
And could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I am a 48-year-old gay trans man. I've lived here in Olympia for about 13 years. I moved out here from the East Coast, originally to go to Evergreen, although that didn't quite work out the way I planned, but I just kind of never left.
Well, I don't blame you. It's the water that gets you.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, let's see.
I use he, him, his pronouns everywhere, always. And I have been a queer activist of one kind or another since I was a teenager. I am currently on the boards of PFLAG Olympia, Partners in Prevention Education and Empowerment.
Oh, wow.
And
Busy,
I'm
busy.
also on the Capital City Pride Planning Committee. I also serve as a facilitator for Pizza Clatch, which is an organization serving GLBTQ youth in our local high schools.
Well, that sounds really, really interesting. You're really out there and busy.
Oh, yes.
So let's see. When did you first realize that you did not identify with the gender you were assigned at birth?
Well, from a very, very young age, I recognized that that my body was not what I needed it to be. For me, it was not so much a question of the gender roles or the gender assignment. It was really a physical matter. And it took me some time. I did not start my transition until I was 38. So it took me really my entire childhood and young adulthood to figure out that what the exact nature of the problem was and that there was something I could do about it.
Do you remember the feelings or emotions that you experienced at the time when you figured it all out?
Okay, I can tell you the exact day when I figured it out and decided that I needed to transition.
Okay.
It was Pride Day of 2005. I had been living here in Olympia for a couple of years. I had been hanging out in Sylvester Park, listening to the music and the speeches, that we have every Capital City Pride Day. And I wandered off down the street to go to Browser's bookshop, and I found a copy of Lauren Cameron's Body Alchemy, which is a book of photographic portraits and stories of trans men. And to be honest, I felt like I'd been hit by a freight train. It was just like this huge light bulb goes on in the brain moment, one of those kind of eureka, why didn't I know about this before? I count that as the day that my transition really began.
The day that you finally knew. You just knew.
Yeah.
I can relate to that.
Yeah.
I really can.
Yeah. I mean, there had been a long period of just deepening depression and frustration leading up to that when I knew more or less that I was not meant to go through life in a female body. But again, I didn't know that there was anything that I could do about it. And finding that book really was what tipped the scales for me and showed me that, oh, this is what's possible. And from there, I went on and sought more information. I did a lot of research. I went to my doctor. I found a therapist.
Wow.
And,
Well, speaking of doctors and healthcare professionals, what has been your experience finding competent healthcare professionals?
I would say that I have found more healthcare professionals that are well-meaning and really wanting to be competent. Not very many who have gotten to that place of full competence yet. When I first figured it out that I needed to start my transition, I went to the doctor that I had been seeing, who was practicing in Tumwater. She was someone who wanted to open healthcare up to GLBTQ people in general and make it much more inclusive. She didn't yet have a clear picture about how she was going to go about that, and I think that I was probably one of her first openly trans patients. So we kind of had to do a lot of educating each other, but I found her to be really open and really, accepting and willing to learn.
Must have been really hard in that time. I mean, I understand.
Yeah. Well, since I had so little information at that time myself, we were it was kind of a case of the halt leading the blind, I guess, that we were just sort of guiding each other through this very new territory.
Yeah.
But she helped me find a therapist, and after that, I'd say my learning curve steepened considerably.
Well, I'm really glad that she was able to work with you and you were able to help her understand more too.
Yeah.
Because it is a learning process.
Yes. I'd say I've had pretty good luck with most health professionals that even if they haven't been thoroughly educated when I met them, they were willing to become so, and I like to think I've helped them a little bit along that path.
Well, certainly I can say thank you for helping all them know and spread the word so that it would be easier for me when I started.
Well, becoming part of the trans advocacy group here in Olympia, one of our original intents was to provide that kind of education for all kinds of professionals: healthcare, law enforcement, social services, business people, city officials, everyone. So that's been kind of an ongoing project for me and for a lot of transgender people here in Olympia.
Yeah, I've heard about some of the work you've done at the Trans Advocacy Group. Now I'm going to ask you some general questions, and you can feel free to answer if you want. You don't have to. Let's start with: have you ever been discriminated against? I know it's
not
a sore
blatantly
topic.
enough that I would necessarily know. For a while, I worked at a hotel in Tumwater. I lost that job in 2010. Haven't managed to find another paying job since then.
Wow.
Hard to say whether that is, how much of that is due to anti-trans bias. But recent studies coming out of Washington, D.C. and other places have shown that transgender people are far less likely to get interviewed, much less hired, than cisgender people. So we know that the bias certainly does exist. And unfortunately, it's the nature of biases of that kind that the person doesn't always know when they've been discriminated against. They may have a suspicion, they may be able to establish a pattern, but being able to follow up on that, take a matter to court, for example, requires a lot of documentation and a lot of knowledge of the law that a lot of people don't have.
Well, that was certainly a really good response, Luke. How about we go to the next question?
Sure.
Have you ever been a victim of violence or abuse?
Well, I grew up in a home with a violent drunk father, but I've never, fortunately, I've been very, very lucky. I have not experienced anti-gay or anti-trans violence. Once or twice when I was a queer activist in college, I got some vague threats, but nothing ever, came of it. So I'm happy to say that I've been relatively free of that. unlike many other people I know.
You and me both. I
Yeah.
understand. I understand.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, I haven't been as lucky, but
Right. Yeah.
I'm really happy that you have not had to really be the victim of physical violence or abuse
Yeah.
in the last 20 years.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, who knows what the future will bring, but so far I've been very fortunate in that regard.
Let's see. Have you ever been homeless?
No, I've had a few times when I didn't have a permanent address, but I've usually managed to find a place to land. I've had periods where I couch surfed with friends or,
Yeah.
stuff like that. But I've never had to find places on the street, for example.
Okay. Okay.
Another area in which I've been very fortunate.
No, I can understand too. I've been pretty fortunate along
Yeah.
those lines as well. Let's see. Do you suffer from depression or anxiety?
I still suffer from pretty pronounced body dysphoria. I am preoperative. I've been on testosterone for just about 10 years. I had my top surgery in 2008, but I have yet to have genital reconstruction surgery. I think that's probably the last major frontier of my transition. Hopefully, I will be able to complete that in the next couple of years if we manage to hang on to the Affordable Care Act and Washington State Medicaid. So that's really the main source of my, the depression and anxiety that I still experience is really, as always, it's always been a body issue for me.
What are some strategies that you have found helpful in overcoming some of these issues when they're really, really bad? How do you get through it?
Well, on a personal level, I'm an artist. I express a lot of that, into my art. And on a public level, just working with the trans community, talking to other people. I go to a lot of support groups.
Well, I can certainly
that
say
helps.
that you've been there for me throughout my transition, and
Well.
it's been a real help having a steady person there that's able to listen and understand as well as know the struggle.
Anytime.
Let's see. So you mentioned that you're an artist. What kind of art do you do?
I draw, I paint, I do a lot of needlework,
Oh, cool.
embroidery, quilting, that sort of stuff.
Here's a tough question we have for you. Have you ever attempted suicide?
I've never made a serious attempt, but there were times in my life when I seriously considered it, when I had pronounced suicidal ideations. It wasn't always due to gender issues, although that was probably always a major underlying factor. For the most part, again, I've been lucky that I've found, compassionate, competent therapists and mental health practitioners who were able to get me through those times. I'm also lucky that I have a good relationship with my friends and family that I'm able to call on. And of course, just having a community around me that understands those issues and is willing to, open up to me and reach out to me when I'm experiencing that, when I'm in a particularly difficult place.
Well, you kind of touched base with the family there. What was their reaction when you came out? How did they react to it?
So I came out twice. First in high school, I came out as a lesbian, which at the time, I'll date myself here, I graduated from high school in 1985. When dinosaurs stalked the earth. And the language at that time was very limited. And I chose the word lesbian because it was one of very few terms that were available to someone who was female assigned and wanted to identify as a part of the queer community. I came out again as trans when I was 38. On both occasions, my mother, who's been my biggest ally throughout my life, was right there for me. Very accepting. When I came out as trans, she did have to go through that adjustment period of letting go of the daughter she thought she had, but she was very quickly able to embrace her son.
Well, that's good.
And to this day, she's been my strongest and staunchest ally, and I'm very, very grateful, for much of the man that I am today, I owe to her.
That's such a moving story. I don't want to cry on the air. You mess up all my makeup. But that was a very touching story, and I thank you for sharing that. Because it's not easy for a lot of parents when they think they've lost a child, when they're really just seeing that child for the first time anew.
Exactly. One of the things that TAG has done recently in partnership with PFLAG Olympia is to start a support group for parents of transgender and gender nonconforming children of all ages.
Oh, wow.
And so far that's been going very well. We've had people with children, ranging in age from like 5 years old to 35 years old, sharing their stories of how they adjusted to their children's gender nonconformity.
Wow, in my day, you understand. In our day, that sort of thing didn't happen, and it's because of people who are visible like you and me and others in the community that stuff like this even gets to happen.
Yeah.
And it's really a good thing, and I'm happy that you are a part of that and able to share your story and help those parents see and understand a little bit more and gain clarity.
Well, the way I look at it is if we want change, we have to make it, because it doesn't just happen by itself. Change occurs because we step up and make it happen.
Yeah.
And I often wonder if I had come out at a much younger age as transgender, what support might there have been, for my mother at that time? And the answer is probably not much. So, I feel because I've been given so much support, and had such good luck and a relatively happy coming out story, I want to make sure that other people have the support, that I've been lucky enough to have.
Well, that is a very admirable quality to have, Luke. And I'm glad that you are in my life to share that and able to share that with all of us watching today.
Well, so am I.
So let's move on to the next question. What is the best thing about being transgender? Away from the sad part, what is the best part about being transgender?
Having such a strong and diverse community to be part of, just having people around me who are so committed to change and to just the general cause of making sure that everyone can live freely on their own terms according to their own sense of identity. That's something that's deeply important to me, and I've found so many people in the trans community that are really committed to, making that the future.
That is such a good response and answer. That was very well done. What message would you like to share with the cisgender community?
I guess I would want cisgender people to know that transgender and gender nonconforming people have always been part of your life, whether you knew it or not, and that we want, for the most part, the same things that everybody else wants. We want to be able to live in peace and freedom and prosperity as who we are. And we may challenge some people's, deeply culturally ingrained ideas of what it means to live in the world as a man or a woman or any other gender. And I would like cisgender people to open their minds and be brave enough to embrace that challenge, to really challenge themselves to think outside of those gender boxes and look at the real diversity of human life, and understand that, gender variant people come to them as emissaries of a broader way of thinking.
Very well put. Very well put. You're doing a lot of good answers today, Luke. Here's another question, and it's to the transgender children that may be watching, or their parents who may be watching, to gain some more information and clarity. What message would you like to share with transgender children who may be watching?
Trust your feelings. You are the expert on your own experience. Nobody knows who you are like you do. People who try to force you to be something other than who you are not necessarily people who have your best interests at heart. So when the world is trying to tell you that who you feel you are is wrong or should be something different, listen to your own heart. and don't be afraid to live in accordance with who you feel you are.
Once again, a very well put, I'm trying not to tear up over here, very well put answer. And we're almost done, so I got a couple more questions. Looking back, would you have done anything differently in your transition?
I wish I had started sooner. Realistically, I don't know whether I would have had the option to start my transition sooner, but if I have any regrets, it's that I waited to such a late age to start. You know, I mean, perhaps, yeah, I mean, woulda, coulda, shoulda, maybe it couldn't have been otherwise, but if I could go back knowing what I know now, I would definitely start hormone therapy and surgery, and I would start that process at a much, much younger age.
The difficulty that so many face is in getting this help from the doctors, and at that time, I understand a lot of doctors did not know,
and yet people were transitioning, you know, at that time and even earlier. I mean, the first known female to male surgery that we know of was done in the late 1920s in England.
That early?
Yeah.
Wow. See, that's something I didn't know.
Yeah. The first male to female surgeries were done actually in the United States, were done right about the time I was born.
Oh. See, I know a little bit about that because I'm male to female.
Right.
So I kind of know a little bit about the history. I'm not totally up on everything.
Yeah. And they were being done overseas even earlier than that.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we've literally been able to somehow acquire the surgery at some point if we went through enough hoops for about 90 years now.
Yeah.
That to me is amazing.
Yes. Yeah, the history of the transgender movement in the United States and beyond is something that has always really fascinated me. I've always been a bit of a history buff.
I can understand. There's a lot of fascinating history out there.
Yeah. Queer history in general is just, you know, something I can study till the cows come home.
Well, maybe one of these days we'll have you on for a special about queer and trans history.
I would like that. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. While I've got you here, we are through the questions.
Okay.
So let's see. You touched a little bit about dealing with medical professionals and all of that. How has the process of getting hormones in the last 5 to 10 years been an issue for you? Have you been able to get them easily, or have you been able to, what has it been like with the insurance companies? Have you seen
Well,
an evolution there?
I find that the barriers are mostly the same barriers that everyone has to getting health care. They are mostly financial and bureaucratic. I went through a long period after I lost my job when I did not have any health care coverage before the Affordable Care Act was signed into law, where I was seeing a doctor out in Lacey, an ARNP, who had been prescribing my hormones, you know, pretty much since my therapist cleared me for hormone therapy, and when I lost my job and my insurance, she was willing to work with me. I did have to pay out of pocket for a while. Fortunately, at the time, testosterone was fairly cheap, and testosterone therapy, that is HRT for trans men, is a little bit simpler and cheaper than HRT for trans women. So, you know, I was able to cover the cost of my hormones during that period. And then when the Affordable Care Act was signed into law, I got on Washington State Medicaid, which covers my hormones and my doctor's visits 100%.
Well, that's
so,
good.
you know, for the last few years, it's been pretty easy.
It's amazing how something as simple as getting someone the proper health care and health insurance can really change a life.
Yeah.
I can attest to that part myself too.
So I'll just put in a plug. This is why it is so important that people vote in November if we want to keep the Affordable Health Care Act. We want to make sure that people have access not just to, you know, transition-related medical tools, but to just all kinds of basic health care, we really need to make sure, you know, that we get the right person in the Oval Office come November.
Well, I believe we have reached the end of our trans truth for you today. I would like to thank you for coming on and sharing your truth with us.
Sure.
It's not an easy thing to do, especially with cameras on you.
Well, I'm very, very out as a trans activist in the community. I'm not at all shy about telling people, you know, that I'm trans. In fact, it's been a little bit interesting that I've gotten to a point in my transition where I am what we call passable enough. That is, I can walk down the street and be indistinguishable from, you know, any other man. That I find I'm actually having to be more proactive about coming out as transgender.
That must be a unique experience
It
for
is.
you.
It is. I mean, like most people, I went through that liminal period early in my transition where, you know, my gender expression was a little bit ambiguous. People could see more easily that I was gender nonconforming. And now, I sort of got used to being visible, you know, as a trans person. And that's not always the case anymore. I have to, if I want people to know I'm trans now, I have to actually tell them, which is, you know, I kind of got lazy there for a little while.
I can understand. So
Yeah.
you needed to take a break, and
Exactly. Yeah.
I can understand that.
Yeah.
Let's see. Well, thank you again for coming on to share your truth, and I look forward to working with you in the future on the show and out in the community here, doing some activism.
Likewise.
And helping to make the world a better place through education and understanding.
Absolutely. Yes.
Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
looks like we have reached the end of today's show. We would like to thank Dr. Ellen Hardin and Luke Miller for helping us to better understand some of the issues surrounding the trans and gender nonconforming community. If you are depressed, suicidal, or just need to talk with someone, you can contact the Trans Lifeline at the number below. These lines are primarily for transgender people experiencing a crisis. This includes people who may be struggling with their gender identity. While their goal is to prevent self-harm, they welcome the call of any transgender person in need. Trans Lifeline does their very best to connect you with services that can help meet your needs. If you are not sure whether you should call or not, then you should give them a call. Their hotline is staffed by trans-identified people educated in the range of difficulties that the transgender community experiences. Until next time, have a lovely day, and you are valid.